You got to operate in truth, right? Operate in truth. Tell the truth.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Gator Truth Florida Football Podcast. I'm Daniel, and on this episode, we're going to take a look at the game in Knoxville against the Tennessee Volunteers, and we'll look ahead to a game that may or may not be played against the Eastern Washington Eagles. Despite losing to the Vols 38-33, I did have fun on my trip to Knoxville, enjoyed watching the game with friends and family. But with that said, one reason or another, we did have a chance to win this game. We just did not pull it off in the end. On the last play of the game, Anthony Richardson gets hit while he's throwing. I do believe if he's not hit, it is a touchdown. I have a video from my perspective on the opposite sideline. I've seen the broadcast perspective. The safety appears to be too far over to be able to make a play if the ball ends up in the middle or back of the end zone. And when the ball is released, Shorter's about 3-4 yards from the corner who's standing squared with the line of scrimmage. So I don't believe that corner's going to get turned around and up to speed in time, much less have the size to deal with Justin Shorter in the end zone. Unfortunately, again, the offensive line didn't hold up for that extra half second to a second to allow Richardson to get the ball off, and Florida falls. It was definitely a fun feeling after the stadium got really cocky, really excited, being up 17 points, to see that we had a chance after that excellent onside kick and recovery by DeJuan Black. The silence in that stadium, the nervousness in that stadium was just something to behold. Unfortunately, we did not pull that off. Moving on to the offense, the first thing I want to talk about is perhaps this was Anthony Richardson's best game as a Gator, not just as a starter, but overall. He ended up accounting for 515 yards of offense and threw for over 450 yards. That is something that is just amazing. Put up the most yards a Florida quarterback has accounted for against an SEC opponent. And that's not just something easily to shrug off. I know I talked about going into the game that Tennessee had a 100th ranked passing defense. So I do think that contributes a little bit. But there's a difference between Richardson getting his passing game going and throwing for about 200, 250 yards and going for 450 yards. So definitely kudos to him. If I had to grade the quarterback position, it would be a B+. I would like to give him more. However, there were a few times that he made some questionable running decisions. And also, he had that key fumble on one of those running decisions that helped the Vols make this a 3-score game. If he scores there, it stays 1 score. But with a turnover, the Vols got the ball, marched down, and then it became a 3-score game. So with that big turning point, I am dropping him down to a B+. Maybe an A-, but we'll say it's somewhere in that range. He did only complete about 54.5% of his passes. However, one thing I would say about that is if you look back at some of these great quarterbacks, and I'll choose Danny Werfel, for example, his Heisman season, Danny Werfel only completed 57.5 yards or 57.5% of his passes. Sorry about that. But what he did average was over 10 yards per attempt. And that is something that Anthony Richardson did the other night. So when you're averaging so many yards, the completion percentage means a little bit less. Now, that doesn't mean it can't get better. That's not saying that he's Danny Werfel. That's not saying anything other than if you're going to be throwing it for 15, 20 yards per completion, if you miss the one pass here and there, it's not as big of a deal. Where if you're throwing a bunch of intermediate passes and averaging about 5 yards per attempt, then that's a whole different ballgame. I do want to see him get more accurate, but with this, there was some good throwaways. Of course, there was the pick at the end, which we've discussed. And in that, there was also a few other issues. But again, needs to get better on the accuracy, but I'm not as concerned when I look at the game as a whole. And when I see that when he was completing balls, he was completing some big time balls down the field. Again, B plus, A minus, great game from Anthony Richardson. Moving on to the running backs, I give them a B for their performance on Saturday. Not because necessarily they did anything wrong, but when none of the backs average 4 yards per carry, it's hard for me to give them above a B. Also, with all the pass rush, since our backs generally stay back for protection, I do have to put a little bit of that on them since we did allow a little more pass rush in this game. I do think some of their running issues were play calling issues in a way. We kept trying to feed it in the middle when Tennessee was definitely stuffing that, selling out against it. When they were giving the balls to the outside or cuts that could go outside the tackle box, that's when we saw big runs from all three of the running backs. Nothing really special this week from them, but also nothing absolutely terrible. No turnovers. So I'm giving them a B. Moving on to the wide receivers and tight ends. For those position groups, I'm going to give them an A. They caught what came to them. They made big plays. Perhaps none bigger than Keon Zipper's big catch, run, powered through several defenders. It was an all-time Gator highlight, in my opinion, just the way he made that play work after catching it. What a great play by him. Definitely deserves it for players coming, worked hard, been waiting for his turn. No one's going to confuse him with a generational talent like Kyle Pitts, but he is a solid tight end for this team and definitely a leader in that position group. On the receiver side of that, we saw lots of great things from Justin Shorter, Henderson, Pearsall, everything that we've been hoping to see from them consistently. Well, as I've said in other episodes, if you get them ball consistently, they will make things happen, and they did. I wish a few of the throws were in front of them, such as the out and up from Pearsall, where they could have done a little bit more after the catch, but I will take it. Again, I believe Shorter was open on that last play if we could have gotten it to him. The one thing that knocks it down from a A plus to an A for me for this group is simply that 2-point play. We can talk about whether it should or shouldn't have happened the first 2-point play, but it was an open pass until the ball was tipped by Zipper, and then Shorter wasn't able to catch it after that tip. With that said, that's the only real blemish I can say from these guys that I saw. So good for them. I expect to see a lot more from them coming up in the future as we move on to opponents like Eastern Washington, if it's played, Missouri, and build confidence for that game against LSU, for that trip to Jacksonville, and for the games beyond that. The offensive line, I'm going to give them a B. They did some great things, created some great pockets in the run game. They did some great pull techniques. There are times that they sealed blocks. However, our inability to open up some of that middle, again, some of it's on the coaching staff for not trying to change it up and still calling some inside runs when it was apparent it wasn't working. But at the same time, there are plenty of times where they allowed pressure or they didn't get space on the inside for the runs. And again, the last play of the game, they did not perform the way they needed to give us that one last shot for at least a jump ball in the end zone. At least, the ball got in the air. Last year against Alabama, the ball didn't get in the air, so we can sort of say there's an improvement there, but I also wouldn't say that Tennessee's defense is near the same level as Alabama's was last year. Although that wasn't a classically great Alabama defense, still better than I think this Tennessee defense is. Moving on to the defensive side, 2 weeks ago, I was saying the defense kept us in the Kentucky game. Last week, our defense seemed to play awful. And then this week against Tennessee, the wheels fell off. It's easy to say, well, that's because Tennessee's got perhaps the best offense we've seen. In a way, that's true. And in a way, it's just like Tennessee was exploiting things they've seen on film. And in a way, I'm curious to what adjustments were or were not made. So to begin, I'm going to look at the defensive line. There were times that the defensive line did get pressure. However, for as many times as they got pressure, they let Hooker get out of the pocket and run way too many, sometimes over pursuing at the end, opening up gaps right in the middle for him just to get out. And I think he ran 40 yards on the second drive of the second half. Containing the quarterback has been a problem. We've seen us fail to do it against Cameron Rising. We saw problems with Gary Bohannon. And of course, with Hendon Hooker, we saw the same things. I don't know what it's going to take for us to be able to form a defensive pocket and collapse it without opening up big gaps for athletic quarterbacks to run through. We may not have to worry about as much about that against Eastern Washington or even possibly Mizzou. However, against LSU, that's going to be something to worry about. Stetson Bennett at Georgia, something to worry about. Max Johnson, currently the starter at A&M, something to worry about. Spencer Rattler, Carolina, something to worry about. Wright at Vandy, actually something to worry about. And then, of course, Jordan Travis at FSU, something to worry about. So when I see these trends keep happening, it is something I want to call out. And even though they got pressure plenty of times, half the times they got pressure, they allowed all this running. And they also allowed several significant runs up the middle from Tennessee. And because of that, that's why the defensive line for this week gets a B-. With that said, I also want to give special shout outs to Big Dez, who played a lot in this game. I was really impressed again with his conditioning. There are some things he could do better, but this is a young guy getting more experience. I did see him get really frustrated when Sapp jumped off sides to give Tennessee a short. I believe it was giving them from 3rd and 6 to 3rd and 1, or maybe gave them the conversion. Originally, I thought he had jumped off sides from my angle in the stadium, and he was frustrated about that. Watching the broadcast is clear. I think this is a guy who knows what he's doing mentally with the game and what should be done. And so that's at least something good to see, a guy who's understanding. Also, Chris McClellan came in, played significant snaps at times, number 7 on the defense. He had one drive where he made 2 great plays, and hopefully we see more of that. The good news is we're seeing more and more youth play, and they are making plays starting up front with the defensive line. Moving on to the linebacker unit. The linebacker unit got 2 forced fumbles and 1 fumble recovery. The other recovery was Trevez Johnson. So they did do some great things during this game. Granted, one of the forced fumbles was on a 4th down, but if they don't force that fumble, maybe the ball gets thrown and they get a completion. There's no 4th down stop. So you got to give credit for that. Ventrell Miller, when he was on the field, did a great job with helping get people lined up. He did make a few great tackles and ended up aggravating his injury when he had to run down Hooker on the previously mentioned 40-yard scramble. So with all that said, I'm giving the linebacker unit a B-. They also, in the passing game, there are plenty of times that we saw mistakes. We did see Shamar James on the last 4th down for Tennessee make a great read and reaction to take the guy down short of the line of gain. That is something that our linebackers did not necessarily do well throughout the day. One linebacker in particular, saw him a few times not rotate, or one time he was in zone while everyone else was in man and waited until the running back coming out of the backfield caught the ball to react. But by that time, it was too late, and the running back scores a touchdown that play. Granted, we also saw Shamar James early on not go wide when the running back started going wide into motion, and that was a screen pass that went for quite a few yards. So our linebackers do need to do a little bit better reading and stepping up. However, I would much rather see that from a Shamar James, from a Scooby Williams. These young freshmen that are getting plenty of playing time and help them develop by seeing those mistakes than I do from players that have been around for a number of years making those same mistakes. I am a very big, if the play is about equal, I'm going to go with the young guy who can help me out down the road, as opposed to the guy who really is not going to get much better based on what we've seen. Moving on to the cornerbacks, these guys I think played overall a great game. I do give them an A. I know it's easy to say, hey, Hooker threw for all these yards. How come you're giving the corners an A when they threw for all these yards? Well, the corners gave up 6 or 7 total completions. The 7th, which I don't believe it's Helm based on everything I'm seeing on this play, but the second busted coverage, it's either Helm or Dean who blew it. With the film studies and whatnot that are out there, typically there's one player who makes that busted coverage where the other doesn't. So I'm going to side with that error. I could be wrong. But with that said, if we just go with the 6 completions, most of them are short hitch routes or comeback routes or quick outs against our corners. So they didn't go for long. I think the longest, there was a long one we'll talk about, but I think the longest completion against a corner for most of the game was the first little comeback hitch route that we were playing soft coverage, which I've talked about. With soft coverage, you throw it short, give a receiver time to make a play. Well, this happened on the first drive. Helm's playing soft by design. The guy takes a hitch. Helm's coming up to take him down, and Ventrell Miller punches the ball out for the forced fumble. The one long pass play that I know for sure that these corners gave up is when Jason Marshall was one-on-one on the 99-yard drive and gives up a 40-something yard pass reception to Tennessee. I can't really knock him on that. His coverage was perfect on that. He was close to his guy. The only way the receiver was catching the ball is if it was put in the right place with an amazing catch. And unfortunately, the ball was put in the perfect place where only the receiver could get it, and he had to make an amazing diving grab to get it. If that ball is not perfect, Marshall has a pick. If that's anywhere short, he's tied on him. So sometimes the other team just makes a play, and I'm not going to knock him for that, and I'm not going to knock the corners for overall having a solid day, where if they wanted to throw at our corners, they had to do these little short routes as opposed to some of the stuff we saw over the middle that was 8, 10, 15 yards down the field, and then the run would happen, where we had certain players not reacting until the guy caught the ball and began running. With that said, I think this is a good time to move on to our nickel/safety. The reason I'm combining these two is because some of the personnel are considered safeties or were recruited as safeties. I'm giving our safeties/star position, i.e. the nickelback, a D on the day. This is because when I looked and saw where all these passes were being completed, there are many that were completed kind of 8-10 yards over the middle, and safeties were not reacting or coming up and making hits until after the ball was caught. If they're reacting as the ball's released and just getting there as the ball's caught, that's a different story. They definitely like to pick on our star position, or at least when our starter was in. The backup star position, I don't believe I saw him give up one reception during the game. The closest was on a screen pass where they had a tight end out wide. I believe it was a tight end out wide blocking him. He did kind of lose contain, didn't keep the outside edge. But with that said, the guy who is supposed to be going out with that receiver, or, the guy for the screen, did not go out with him. And so little things like that. And of course, we can talk about the 1 or 2 major busted coverages on the day that really helped change the game, really change the momentum, especially after, for example, Florida's first touchdown drive, where the previous 2 drives we had moved the ball, but just ended up with no points. And during that time, we had held Tennessee to 3 points. We looked like the only one stopping our offense was us. We go down, score a touchdown, get that momentum. Tennessee's questioning, are we really going to be able to handle this game the way we thought we would? And instead of forcing them to make a longer drive or hoping that they make a mistake or forcing a mistake, we make a mistake very early in the drive, allow Tennessee to get a 70-yard pass off, which really helped to ignite that crowd and bring the crowd into the game, where before they had started to get nervous, a little bit quieter. That really woke up the fans in Neyland Stadium. Moving on to the special teams, I do want to hit on a few things there. For the special teams, I don't know why we don't change who's returning kicks. I don't know why we tend to not either fair catch those kickoffs, which are equivalent to a touchback, or take more touchbacks. We ended up with the ball inside the 20 multiple times because of that. And I also don't know why when we're kicking the ball off, we are kicking it short. I do know the theory is if we kick it short, kick it high, maybe our returners get down and the other team starts inside the 25, so it's better than a touchback. The problem is the execution hasn't been there all year. We've allowed numerous teams to have big returns on us, getting the ball to the 30, 35, 40-yard line because we've decided to try these high kicks. I would rather us just kick out of the back of the end zone every single time. And with field goals, I really can't say much about our missed 50-yard field goal. We've seen Mcclellan hit that kick before. He did miss on this one. He is still relatively new. His first kick in an away game, he missed it. I would rather him hit it, but I'm not going to be upset that a new kicker in his first road start missed a 50-yarder. Just get it next time. And on the flip side, he did have a really, really good onside kick on that second one. Again, kudos to DeJuan Black for making that recovery. So, with all this said, talking about this 38-33 loss, I did say last week about the offense. I think we need about 6 games or at least half a season before we start talking about, is this scheme right, not right? I do feel the same way about the defense. However, I say that about the schemes. What I will not say that about is some of these personnel decisions. If we've seen on film some personnel making the same mistakes for not just 4 games, but for years, that's where I've got to step back and say, hey, I thought that they'd be improved under the coaching. They're really not. And now we're going to see what this coaching staff is made of. Are they going to make personnel changes to who starts, who gets more snaps, or aren't they? I really do hate to be asking this question, but I think it is relevant at this time. And the reason for that is there's no better week in the season than this week if you're going to make those changes. The reasoning for that is this. If you're going to start young guys, as young guys are the only ones who can step into a few of these positions, a good first start would be against an FCS team like an Eastern Washington if that game happens. That's followed up with a Mizzou team that is not really that great. So it could help them have 2 weeks of good games and confidence going into the LSU game. And of course, the LSU game, then there's a bye week, and then there's the trip to Jacksonville. One thing I wouldn't want to see is these young guys getting their first starts in Jacksonville against this Georgia team. So when I look at where the schedule takes us, now seems to be the best time as far as games as any to make that change. I said on Twitter plenty before the season when people were saying, if this person starts against Utah, I'm going to riot or I'm going to be mad or whatnot. My entire thing was, let's let the coaches make these personnel decisions. And if they feel they're playing the best, maybe these guys have improved. Well, some of them have, some of them have not. So the question now is, based on what we've seen on film, do you make this change and start building for the future? Because the way I see it is if the young guys are that you're willing to put in the game after they blow a coverage, and have the young guy come in right for them and play the entire next series, if you're willing to do that, and it's about equal output here, the equal output, I give it to the young guy and let us build for the future, like I said earlier. And again, I'm not talking about any one specific player, but there are a few that could come down in that list that we could see some younger guys taking over starting roles. And I think that would also speak a lot to our recruits when they see, hey, if I come in and I'm better than someone who's an upperclassman or more experienced in this team than I am, if I play better, practice better, and there's bad performances, I'm going to get to play under the staff, or I'm going to get an opportunity, where we know for sure that was not the case with Dan Mullen's staff. And so right now, I do think this is a key moment to watch. If we continue to see this and don't see these changes, well, then there might be other conversations coming up. I'm not saying there should be. I'm not saying there will be. But I am saying it is a storyline to watch with our personnel going forward. Turning our attention real quick to the Eastern Washington game with Hurricane Ian out there, we do not know if this game will be played. Scott Strickland has said the game is currently going ahead as scheduled. Obviously, with the path of the hurricane in a constant state of flux right now, and all sorts of other questions going on. How strong will it be when it gets to Florida? How long it'll be here? With all that said, I'm going to assume it gets played until they cancel it. But because we're not sure, I figured I'd throw it in with this episode. This is a decent FCS team in Eastern Washington. However, this is also an FCS team that Oregon hung 70 on. And I do not believe the Ducks are really that great this year. I could be wrong about that, but since they hung 70, that is something to keep an eye on and should tell us that this is a team we should be able to overpower. Also, a big game, if it is played, to get your young guys some playing time, get them that experience so maybe they can break into the rotation like a Chris Mcclellan has done, or like a Shamar James has done, or even a Devin Moore or Kamari Wilson. Those guys have come in and have done decently well in their rotation spots. They could also end up starting several games. Shamar James did start the USF game. Yes, I know what the depth chart said, but I also know who I saw on the field for the first snap, and that was, of course, Shamar James. I think USF was a wasted opportunity to get very important reps for these players. Eastern Washington might be our last opportunity to get some of these younger guys significant reps, especially since we have 4 games that they can use before redshirting. So if this opportunity happens, it may be a big thing for us, just in that we can see some young guys get in and they can get used to the speed of the college game. Well, everyone, that's all I have for today. I do have some questions that have been sent in that, providing I have power later in the week, I may just do a question and answer episode. Feel free to send something in if you're listening. Hit me up either on YouTube, send me a message on Twitter, however you'd like to do it. And thank you, everyone who's taken the time not only to listen, but people that have shared our stuff on Twitter, on Facebook, and different forums you're a part of. Thank you, everyone, for your support. It does mean a lot to me. And as always, go Gators.